Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael S. Sieber. You're listening to Equal Chance to Be Unequal, my podcast about unlocking human potential through helping people disconnected from their purpose uncover and live their purpose. Good day, everyone. In today's episode of my podcast, Equal Chance to Be Unequal, I'm going to share my thoughts about leading through change and things that you can do to lead yourself and or your teams through really significant changes. And so what I'd like to do to kick off our time together is facilitate a little bit of a reflection for you, just something to think about, walk you through a few societal adjustments and changes and maybe some changes in norms that I'm seeing. Maybe you have a few things that you can add to the list. Talk a little bit about why change is so difficult for humans to absorb and to want to go through or to want to become better by. Look a little bit at why our brains do what they do when it comes to change and how that impacts our ability to facilitate change rapidly. Take a couple steps back and think a little bit about how do we need to approach change from an organizational standpoint, from a very, very high level, or kind of look at it from a big picture standpoint, say what do we need to do ahead of time before we're about ready to implement the change, to make sure that it is accepted and implemented and that you achieve your goals, the stated objectives that you have for that specific change initiative. And then dive a little bit more deeply into if you have individuals on your team who are skeptical, maybe they're neutral, maybe they're already on board with the change, what are some really tactical things that you can do in a face-to-face meeting with them to make sure that they are on board with the change, or maybe potentially they leave your organization, right? There's a lot of different things that can happen. And then I'll wrap up our time together today with just a review of best practices, a few things to think about as you're about ready to facilitate some sort of change initiative inside your business. So to get started, just a little bit of a moment of reflection, and I've been able to do this quite a bit for myself, but also thinking about it for organizations that I've consulted with and helped them through some sort of a major change initiative. I want you to reflect back to the last, let's say, 6, 7, 8, 9 months and think about one specific change initiative that you have had to facilitate inside your organization. And what I want you to think about was on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, what would you rate yourself or what would you rate the organization on whether or not the change was implemented well and whether or not the change actually met its stated objectives? And I just want you to think about that. And for a second, even if you have to pause this podcast and stew on it for a minute, I think it's important. Because if we can look objectively at the past and really, really want to think about what are the things that we can do to improve our capacity to drive change, the probability that we're going to hit our goals and or hit our organization's goals are far higher. So take a few moments to think about what one specific change initiative that you've facilitated for yourself or for your organization in the last 6 to 9 months. And how would you rate yourself? 1 being low, 10 being high. So one of the things that I'm really intrigued by is Jim Collins' book back in the late 1990s called Good to Great. Did some research basically looking at what % of change initiatives inside organizations actually achieve the stated objectives that the organization had for that change initiative. And so through his work in the late 90s, and then the McKinsey & Company, large consulting group, had also done some similar research attempting to figure out, is Collins' work still valid into the 2000s and now more recently? And so they had done some research, I believe it was in 2008 and then also in 2015, really looking at and trying to assess how valid is Collins' work? Are we getting better as a society? Are we better at change? Are we not? And so through that research, through Collins' research, through the McKinsey & Company research, what they found was that of all of the stated objectives inside of a corporation when they're trying to facilitate a change initiative, 70% of the time, the change initiative fails to meet its stated objectives. And so that's a pretty staggering number when you think about it, that only roughly 30% of change initiatives actually meet or exceed their initiatives or their initial goals. And so societally, we have this big adjustment and change happening where we're not doing very, very good at facilitating change hierarchically inside of our businesses, but it's become an increasingly important part of our day, right? The only constant in life is change. So how do we, as a person or as a company or as a nation, become better at change? So I think there's lessons to be learned from McKinsey & Company's research. There was an article not too long ago from McKinsey, I think it was May 2016, it's called The 4 Building Blocks of Change. I'd encourage you to look on the web and potentially consider reading that article because it is a pretty good look at the research, but also some of the things that they suggest or recommend could help you through the change process. I also like to look at change from the standpoint of if we do not do the change, right, undoubtedly there's going to be some cost to your organization as a result of the change not going smoothly. And so I'll ask this question of audiences when I travel and when I work with organizations in Metro Phoenix where I live. And what we oftentimes come up with, right, is that the cost to the organization of the change not going well could be missed opportunity cost, right, where we're investing money into something that doesn't go smoothly. That money could have been utilized for something else that would be more value add. Obviously, there's a big opportunity for employee turnover if the person doesn't want to work for your organization anymore because the change that the organization is going to go through doesn't align with his or her personal mission. Employee turnover and the costs associated with it could be very hefty. For people who become disengaged during the change initiative, we have to be concerned with lost productivity. And that could be very costly too, especially if you have some really interesting stretch goals you're trying to reach, but people are only giving you 40, 50, 60% of their capacity in that week. So lost productivity is a big one. We think about misused capital. I think about employee disengagement and potential sabotage. I've worked with some clients who have had employees sabotage parts of the change initiative process. And so that becomes harder because then you have to deal with disciplinary action. And in certain cases, sometimes legal action becomes important. And then, of course, one of the things that's not talked about often, but is actually pretty important for the folks I serve at the senior level, is that there's a level of feeling as though they failed, a level of embarrassment that comes from really wanting to have a change initiative succeed, but then it doesn't succeed because of lack of support from the top or because of poor communication or because the structure to facilitate it wasn't there. There wasn't enough communication and training on the front side. Some other external events happened during the change initiative process. There are many things that can pop up to derail this, but we have to be considerate of these costs. So when we think about not being good at implementing change, there are many costs associated with that. We have to be aware of them. So when I think about things that are changing in society, and if you've listened to a few other of my podcasts, I've talked about a few of these things, but I think they're important to recognize. And you're more than welcome to, through social media, through my email, please feel free to reach out to me and say, hey, I also think that these are big societal changes that are occurring and really adjusting the way we go about business. I'd love to hear from you. So one of the things I think that's happening that's really critical is this idea that we're moving from an arena of traditional push advertising, marketing, public relations to a more pull scenario where via social media there's been a democratization of information where people can collect and gather data and information and ideas and tools from people that are roughly at their level socioeconomically. So we don't have to worry so much about collecting information from traditional corporate hierarchical structures, although they do have messages that they do push out to consumers. Many people aren't necessarily believing those anymore. And so what we're seeing is that I've seen a couple different pieces of data here, but HubSpot had done some research and they had found that only 16% of millennials, right, those folks born between 1980 and 2000, only 16% of them believe corporate advertising. So for those very large corporations that are spending a lot of money on advertising or marketing or public relations, the message probably is landing with baby boomers, and it probably is landing with Gen X, at least a little bit. But for Gen Y, the millennials, roughly 16% of those millennials believe the corporate advertising. They're not as interested in it anymore. So we have to be very cognizant of is that if we have a message, of a very important message, we have to think about how do we get it down to the front line levels or to the masses or to the consumers in a way that is very authentic and that it feels like it's coming from very influential people at that level or in that person's group. So just developing a message and pushing it down, no longer as valuable as engaging people in dialogue, discussion, giving them information, helping them in some way, and allowing them to disseminate your message to their groups in various ways that they prefer to communicate. The second thing here that I'm seeing changed in society, obviously, is entrepreneurship. Because many large hierarchical governance models and structures aren't working, right? Millennials don't believe in them. They're not transparent. They put money and profit before they put people or the planet. And there are all of these reasons why they're no longer as powerful as they used to be. And so many people, because cradle to grave employment and similar things don't exist anymore, we've seen a very, very big influx of entrepreneurship because the full-time jobs aren't there anymore, because cradle to grave employment doesn't exist. And so in order to make ends meet, in order for millennials to deal with the more than $1 trillion in school debt that they have, we have to find ways to be able to make additional money to be able to cover our expenses and to be able to begin life the way that generations before the millennials have or did. And so we're seeing this movement away from wanting to go get the corporate job and to stay in one place for a very long time, whereas Bureau of Labor Statistics has some data from last year that millennials are staying in jobs for 1.4 to 1.5 years, so not very, very long. Whereas more previous or older generations are obviously staying in their jobs for quite a bit longer. I like entrepreneurship for a different reason, and that is I believe it's the fastest way to connect your personal mission to making money. And what I mean by that is that the entrepreneurship is an incredible learning tool, right? It forces you to learn very, very specific things about your communication style and what motivates you and how you add value to society. What's your value proposition as a person or a business? And I just believe that it's a tremendous accelerator when it comes to you learning about yourself and being able to add value consciously to your community. So yes, there aren't the same jobs there that used to be, 20 years ago, but I also believe that it's a really unique tool to help people learn and develop themselves. Now, the third thing here is this idea of something called fundamental attribution error. And what this is that when we think about baby boomers or sometimes early Gen X folks, they tend to look at millennials or Generation Z, which is people born after the year 2000. They tend to say that the millennials or Gen Z, that they're lazy or they're spoiled or they're entitled or they're narcissistic, or they have all of these different derogatory terms that they attempt to utilize to describe the generation. And there probably are people that fit that bill. There probably are people that can be described that way or do behave that way. But I don't believe that that's true of the entire generation. I believe that it's a slightly different thing. And so what happens is that a baby boomer or a Gen X person looks at a millennial and sees that he or she is struggling with something, and they automatically think that the person's struggles are the result of his or her character, the content of his or her character. But when that exact same struggle happens to the baby boomer or the Gen X person, they don't blame it on their own character, they blame it on the environment around them. And so it's a fundamental attribution error. It just says we're attributing that person's problems either to the content of their character or the environment around them. In my experience is that the more experienced generations are spending a lot more time blaming the person, the millennial, as opposed to really taking into consideration the environment or the context around that millennial, and really thinking about how has technology or the internet changed the way that the millennial tries to fit into society, or how has technology or the environment changed the way that millennials have to get extra education, go into debt $100,000, don't have enough money to then buy cars or to buy houses or to get married at the same age as previous generations. So I'm just aware of fundamental attribution error really contributing to the divisiveness between generations, when in reality all generations are very, 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 very similar. And so what I think more experienced generations are forgetting is that when they were in their late teenage years or when they were in their 20s, they were going through a period of very significant self-discovery as well. And I think if they could turn back the clock mentally and think about the choices that they made or the things that they were doing at that same point in time, they would realize that what a millennial is experiencing isn't all that dissimilar from what the baby boomer or Gen X person felt at that exact same phase in their life. So just a little bit of trust and respect and giving some credit to younger persons who are having to deal with things that previous generations never had to deal with, in terms of not having cradle-to-grave employment or not having the internet, or having the internet and how it impacts their ability to be able to learn, develop, and acclimate into society. So there are many, many things that are adjusting and changing in our society away from traditional corporate push advertising not working. Cradle-to-grave employment doesn't exist, so now we have to make money through things that are very entrepreneurial. And then, of course, things like fundamental attribution error and getting people to be more cognizant of the fact that younger folks are just as motivated, have just as much of a desire to make an impact on society, have just as much of a desire to be able to make money and start families as previous generations, just that the environment and the context around them is very, very different. They're doing the best that they can within the structure that they've been provided. So now I want to think a little bit more granular at what makes change difficult for humans. And so we just talked a little bit about some of the things that are happening societally. Now I want to get a little bit more deep to talk about the factors that I'm seeing as being important that I'm taking into consideration when I'm trying to coach an executive team or their direct reports through a process. And so if you think about in your mind, what are the things that make change difficult? There are probably a lot of different things that come into your mind, and go ahead and think about those things. I'm going to list a few things here to get you to think about them as well. So the first thing that I look at is the individual's thinking or behavioral preference. And so if you've done Myers-Briggs, DISC, StrengthsFinder, Hogan, Colby, Emergenetics, Predictive Index, there's a number of personality assessments that are out there and available to you. If you haven't done one, I would encourage you to take one, because what it'll do is it'll expose your thinking and behavioral preferences to you and help you to understand and become aware of how is your brain hardwired, and then you'll be able to look at other people around you to understand how is his or her brain hardwired and how does that impact his or her ability to be able to deal with change. And so I'll talk about the DISC and something called the 12 driving forces here in a second, but I want to make sure that we're very cognizant of the fact that even though you might have a very, very specific thinking or behavioral preference, the probability of another person around you having that exact same style is very slim. And in order for us to become great change agents, we need to be able to adjust or amend our style to the style of the person we're attempting to facilitate through the change process. We can't just every time do it our way. We have to lead them through a process of self-discovery to get them to be more on board with whatever the change might be. The second factor I'm looking for is what motivates the person. And I use an assessment called the 12 driving forces. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to describe that. But I want you to think about what are the things that truly motivate your behavior and or potentially motivate the behavior of the persons around you, because it might be different. Sometimes people are motivated by altruistic giving of themselves to others. Sometimes people are motivated by power and controlling their own destiny. Sometimes people are motivated by wealth production and return on investment and being very efficient with their time. So each of us has a different motivator. The trick becomes is how do we turn on that motivator in a way that gets the person to take action in the achievement of the organization's goals. And if we don't know that motivator from the person, we haven't had that conversation with him or her, it's hard to get them moving down the path because we're expecting them to go down a path that's very uncomfortable for them or doesn't make sense to them, or they're not seeing how it's connected to their long-term goals as an individual. Third factor I like to take into consideration is a person's value structure. And values are very, very similar to motivators in that they're looking at the why of what you do. But I think values are a little bit different than motivators in that values take into consideration some pretty important lessons that you've learned in life or some pretty interesting experiences that you've had that have shaped you and that help to make you who you are today. Some of the things that you really want to devote time to and focus on. So the values, your core values, your personal values, I think are another factor that can make change different, especially if yours are very different than someone else's. So the fourth factor that I look at when thinking about human factors that make change difficult is a person's life's experiences. And so the thinking and behavioral preferences and the motivators and even a little bit of their values, I think of that as the nature side of who the person is. And I look at life's experiences as being the nurture side of who that person is. And what I mean by this is that we tend to go through really specific recurrent challenges in our teenage years and our 20s. And so those things shape us and help us to become the people that we are later down the road. And so if we don't take those things into consideration and think about those recurrent challenges, or we think about those lessons learned, or we think about the strength that was built through that process, it becomes very difficult for us as leaders to be able to help those persons through things, because whenever there is a very significant emotional reactivity today, there is always a very significant wound in that person's past. And if we as leaders don't understand where those wounds come from, we probably will confront them at some point during the change process, and then we're going to experience a lot of negativity or pessimism or some sort of an emotional reaction that we can't have happen because it's going to make the change initiative roll out harder or prolong it or make it more difficult. So if we, before the change initiative is happening, can really thoroughly understand how a person's life's experiences have shaped them, it makes it a lot simpler for us to know what buttons to press or to not press to help them through the process. A couple other things here. When I think about change, think about emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence for me, and I've got some articles on my blog about this. I've also done another podcast episode. Episode number 2 was actually about emotional intelligence, so I'd encourage you to listen to it. But what emotional intelligence is it's a look at self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and your capacity for relationship management or building. And so if a person is very, very technically sound at what they do, but they have very, very low emotional intelligence, meaning they don't have the capacity to self-regulate their own emotions, they are really not aware of how another person is thinking or feeling or behaving, and they don't have the ability to adjust to that, or they don't understand the value of building deep and meaningful relationships, and they're unaware of the process that it takes to get to that point with multiple relationships simultaneously. That low emotional intelligence is really going to inhibit that person's ability to go through change quickly. So we would like to assess from our team members what his or her emotional intelligence is ahead of time. And so the last one here that I'll talk about is this idea of fears. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk about the DISC and the different fear types. But when we think about fears, all humans have fears. And so if we know what the fears are of our team members or even for us as individuals, it's a lot easier to know what things we need to confront in order to overcome the change initiative or to overcome the fear. So factors that make change difficult, thinking behavioral preferences, what motivates a person, their core values, many of the life's experiences that they've had, their emotional intelligence, or even specific fears that they have or that they verbalize to you. How can we help them through that? Another thing that I think is really critical here is just to remember Gallup. So if you've ever visited Gallup.com, you would know that Gallup tracks employee engagement. And so in 2015, I think more recently, just a couple months ago in early 2017, they've released something called the State of the American Workforce Report. And in the 2015 version, what they had found was that there are different levels of employee engagement depending on generation. So as an example, from the 2015 report, the silent generation, those folks born between 46 and 64, had a 42% employee engagement, meaning that 42% of the people in the workforce from that age range actually like their work. Baby boomers were 33%, Generation X is 32%, and from the report, Generation Y, the millennials, is only 29%. So you see a 13-point differential from one generation to the next for a lot of different reasons, but it's still interesting to me that we continue to operate in a societal structure that still only delivers 30 to 40% happiness in terms of people actually liking what they do on a day-to-day basis. So we have to think about change being difficult because very few of the employees on our team are actually engaged by their work. So because they're not engaged, they're not going to want to go through the change process with you. So just be cognizant of that as you're thinking about the change for your organization. So I mentioned a little bit ago the DISC assessment and what do we need to do to utilize this in the change process. And so as I mentioned, I'm certified to deliver this and the 12 driving forces. And when I think about DISC, this is a very, very important tool for me to help teams become more cohesive, become more engaged, to communicate more effectively, to set up the right structures inside the business to make sure that one-to-one or group meetings happen well, to make sure that one-to-one talk inside of a cubicle or an office or during or by the water cooler or at lunch, to make sure that it's all very, very effective and helpful. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples about how this impacts the process. So if a person, as an example, is an extrovert, right? So people who are D or I on the DISC profile, they tend to think of themselves as being more powerful than the environment around them, and they're very innovative. They love to start things from scratch. But if you try to plug a D or an I person into a role on a change initiative that requires them to be the maintenance, or that requires them to be the implementation, or requires them to be the person that closes the project with a lot of detail orientation, they are not going to be successful. It is just not how their brain is hardwired to behave. They like to start new things. So anytime that we confront that for them, it's going to make them disengaged or not happy. Now, conversely, if you have a person who's an S or a C on the disc, they're a bit more introverted. Now, they view themselves as a little less powerful than the environment, meaning they like to collaborate, they like to be in support of other leaders, and they like to be the implementer. They like to be the maintenance and or the closing person through a project. So we would want to give them supporting roles that allows them to manage details. So if we ever cross those roles and put an S or a C who's an introvert into a leading role for a project, they are going to not be nearly as successful as an extrovert just because their brain is hardwired to want to make decisions more slowly, to want to avoid to make the tough decisions, to not want to confront people around them. There are a lot of different factors and reasons that I could go into at a later date, but it's important to recognize that the thinking or behavioral preference does impact their capacity to want to go through the change initiative. So the D or the I, much more willing to accept change. The S or the C likes a little bit more of the traditional historical look at change. As an example, a D person, what I'm really looking for through negotiation or conflict as an example, is that a person who is a D on the disc, when it comes to conflict or negotiation, they love to compete. So their preference when it comes to competition or when it comes to having to work through a change initiative is that they really like win-lose scenarios. And so their major fear is being taken advantage of or being out of control or having to be vulnerable. So that's why they want to compete. They want to find an opportunity or a position for themselves to be in a leadership role where other people just do what they say to do. And so in many cases that can work. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that they can be good leaders, but we also have to be aware of making sure that we know that their preference during this process is to compete. It's not to collaborate. Whereas a person who's a higher I on the disc, they are much, much more collaborative. So during the process of facilitating a change, they're much more about trying to find ways to get to win-win through a negotiation or through some sort of conflict because they're very optimistic. They definitely want there to be an acceptance via everybody in the group because a high I person fears social rejection or being ignored. So they go over the top to make sure that all parties are involved in some meaningful way. With an S person, when it comes to conflict, they tend to accommodate. They're not very assertive in getting out of the process what they need, but they are definitely accommodating to make sure that whatever the rest of the group needs, they're very cooperative in that process. So if you have a person on your team who's very non-emotional, who has a very, very good poker face, they fear a loss of long-term security, right? They fear a loss of harmony from the group. So they're not going to do anything to try to disrupt that status quo. They're going to be great at accommodating others through a change initiative, but it's our job as leaders to make sure we go in and tackle them and spend a little bit of time with them to understand what are they struggling with and how can we help them through that. And then last, for the high C person, when it comes to conflict and when it comes to going through the process of trying to negotiate a change, they tend to avoid the scenario or situation. So they're going to be the ones that push off meetings into the future or that don't want to talk with you about it today. They don't want to be too heavily involved in some sort of a change process because their underlying fear is that they fear criticism of their work or they fear being wrong. And so their number one default emotion is fear because they view the environment around them unfavorably, but they view themselves as less powerful than the environment. So they're very detail oriented. They are tremendous at finance, accounting, and more administrative type support work. So they're a very, very critical part of the process. We need them on the team, but we have to make sure that we go to them and ask them a ton of questions to make sure that we're able to pull out the things that are really important to them through the process. Even though you might be one specific thinking or behavioral preference, we have to be very, very cognizant that there are at least 3 other styles, and we have to be able to adjust or amend our style to those other persons in a way that gets them engaged or involved in the process. And this is why 70% of change initiatives fail, because we don't take the time up front to know what other persons on our team are and to figure out a way to engage them in a process in a way that gets the organization towards its goals, but does a really good job of making sure that we're pushing that individual towards his or her goals at the same time. As I mentioned a minute ago, the 12 driving forces is another thing that comes from TTI Success Insights in North Scottsdale, Arizona. And so I'm certified to deliver this particular assessment. And there are 12 driving forces, of which I'm not going to mention them all, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples in how they potentially impact our capacity to lead teams. And so give a few examples. So as an example, if somebody is overly commanding, where one of the 12 driving forces is commanding, and so these persons are really, really heavily driven by status, being recognized readily, having control over their personal day, personal time. They like power. So if you have a person who's motivated by commanding, but they're put into a role that's very supportive, it doesn't allow them to be in charge, it doesn't allow them to make decisions, the probability of them being engaged or wanting to do the work is very minimal. So if we don't know this about a person and we place them into a supportive role, they're not going to be very productive, and we got to be aware of that. Additionally, if we have a person who's receptive, so another 12 driving force is called receptive, and these people love really new ideas, they love new methods, they're really interested in creating new opportunities that fall outside of traditional systems, and so these folks are very entrepreneurial. If we place these persons inside of a structure that's incredibly hierarchical, it's incredibly rule-driven, it functions very much like a governmental agency or institution, they are going to really struggle because their brain thinks creativity and innovation, but we're placing them inside of a system that forces them to follow very specific rules that their brain doesn't want to follow. And so we have to think about these things when we think about facilitating change. Now, another one could be this idea of, last example here is this one called harmonious. And so folks that are harmonious, when it comes to conflict and change, they very much love very subjective, very in-the-moment experiences. They love a balance in their surroundings. They love very beautiful spaces, whether outdoors or inside of an office. So if you take them and put them into a cubicle that doesn't allow them to dress up their place, or you put them into a very chaotic, change-oriented environment, it's going to be a really tough fit for them unless they have good coaching and good leadership. So we can't ignore the motivational style of the person, because if we place them into a scenario that's totally opposite of what motivates them or why they do what they do, very, very difficult for them to engage. So it's not that they can't, and by telling you these things about the DISC or the 12 driving forces, it's not that they can't do it. People can have the learned behavior to be able to pull it off or to be able to fit in. You just have to understand it's going to take a little bit more work from them or from you to make sure that we're getting them engaged with the change initiative. And as I mentioned a few minutes back, we talked a little bit about your life's experiences or a person's life's experiences. I look at a person's life's journey a little bit different, I think, than the average person. And so imagine, if you can, on the y-axis of a chart, activity, how a person spends his or her time. And the x-axis would be time. And so from the very left-hand side of the x-axis would be someone's birth, all the way to the right-hand side, which would be their death. Now imagine that each person on your team, or you specifically, you have one specific purpose on this planet. I'm going to call that your life's mission. So imagine when you're born, all the way up to age 25 to 28 to 30, you spend an awful lot of time doing a lot of different types of activity. And oftentimes that activity is not in alignment with your life's mission or why you were placed on this planet. So imagine this incredibly zigzagged line going up and down all the way around this life's mission for you. And imagine that as you're going through that, you're learning a whole lot. You're learning what you'd like. You're learning what is not important to you. You're learning what you should spend time on. You're learning who in your life you want to have close. Right? This activity is good because it starts to narrow the things that are important to you. So then many people have referred to this as the quarter life crisis, but then around age 28 or 30, a person is likely going to have to start cutting out activity that is not value add to them. And so what we've now referred to as the quarter life crisis is we're looking at all of this activity that we used to spend our time on, and now we don't want to do all those things because we're feeling a bit lost. We want to define who we are, we want to define our brand, and we want to live our life's mission, but we don't know what activities to cut out. Now, the reason I bring this up is that oftentimes becomes my job as an executive coach, is to look at the person's calendar and to look at how they spend their time and to figure out which activities they're spending their time on is not value add to their life's mission. So for you as a leader or for you as a person facilitating change, this might be something you have to consider for some of the people on your team who can't seem to get engaged or who constantly seem to be distracted or who have too many other things going on that's not allowing them to contribute to your team. Because between age 30 and roughly 48 or 50, we need them to be spending time on things that are actually more value add to their life's mission. Because what many people now refer to in our society as the midlife crisis happens roughly between age 48 and 50. And what society has romanticized that to become has been a spouse becomes unfaithful to the other spouse, or a male, goes and buys a fancy sports car, or female, takes trips and goes shopping and does A, B, and C. But really what's happening between age 28 and 30 and 48 and 50 is the individual is kind of going through a little bit of a crisis and understanding, okay, I'm spending my time, a lot of time on these 10 things, but I really only care about 5 of them. And so which 5 of them do I choose to spend time on to make sure that I'm living my life's mission every single day? So depending on a person's generation or their age or what phase of his or her life they're in, it is pretty critical to understand you might have to coach a little bit differently depending on where they're in their life's mission or how close they're living to their mission or what phase of their life they're in. So again, not a lot of people talk about that, but I think it's really important. Many of the folks that I coach and engage with and have to facilitate change through, I'm very, very cognizant of where they're at in life and whether or not they've gone through the quarter life or the midlife crisis, because that will help to shape the things that I do and say as a coach to them. I want to talk just a few minutes here about something more big picture, right? We just looked at DISC and 12 driving forces and kind of the nurture side of the equation and with regards to a person's mission. But when we're trying to lead through change, right, before we embark upon that change initiative or that adventure, let's take a step back and look at it and say, okay, we've got this specific change initiative that we need to implement. How do we go about doing that? So one of the very first things that I'm always trying to do is to connect whatever that initiative is, connect it directly to the organization's mission, to its 3-year vision, to its value proposition, the thing that makes it different in the marketplace, and or its core values. So if we can connect any part of the change initiative to those things, it's really easy for us to engage people who are already working really hard for us because their own life's mission is connected to the mission of the business. Now, second here, when we're really embarking upon this journey, is who do we need to build relationships with and influence ahead of time? And so if you haven't read Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, I believe it was published in the late 80s. It's probably been updated a couple times since. But one of the most critical aspects or components of facilitating a change initiative is the sponsorship or the support that you have from leaders above you, or the support that you have from peers at your level, or if there are a couple of key influencers at other layers in the organization that are supportive of this process. Before you go upon embarking on this change, we got to make sure that we've got quite a few people who are willing to support us through it. And so before we embark upon it, I'm always thinking about who are the people on the team that I need to have on board and have influenced prior to going live with whatever the change is. Now, depending on a person's DISC preference or depending on their right or left brain preference, right brain being a bit more creative, right left brain being a bit more data-driven, we always want to make sure that we have really solid evidence, right, to appeal to the left brain person that the change we're about ready to go through is good. So do we have case studies and subject matter expert opinion and data from other departments within our organization? But at the same time, do we have good emotional stories from our customers, from our internal employees, from the marketplace, from other people to suggest that emotionally this particular change is going to be beneficial? So ahead of time, I'm trying to consider what are the very tactical, logical, data-driven things that we need first to facilitate the change, but also what are the emotional stories that are going to help more intuitive folks get bought into wanting to be a part of the change. So again, before we embark upon this initiative, that is an important piece. Another big thing that we need to consider is that humans, right, are very immersive learners. They're very experiential learners. And so if there is any way for you to facilitate some sort of immersive learning experience before the change initiative starts, it is going to be very helpful. An example of an immersive experience might be that you're going to be moving one team or one department or one piece of your organization from one state to the next or from one building to the next. And I've worked with clients where we've had to facilitate that change, where we've had to uproot people from one state to move them to another. And so if there's any way to create an experience where you allow the persons on that team to go to the new facility or location where their offices or cubicles are going to be, or they can see where they would get lunch or where they'd use the washroom or where they would meet other colleagues or where they would meet clients, creating that experience ahead of time so that there's less nervousness or anxiety around it is really critical to that person being more supportive of the change initiative. So what can you do to create that experiential learning piece ahead of time to make sure that we're getting the person to be more on board with the change before it actually happens? And so even before we start on the journey, I also like to think about small wins. And I'll talk about small wins when I talk about Kotter's 8-step model of change. But I think about small wins quite a bit, especially if the change initiative doesn't have the best brand inside your business or your organization. What are those small wins that you can manufacture and create kind of at the beginning of the journey that help people to be on board with the change? They see the momentum coming from their other colleagues who are already on board and wanting to be a part of the change, or they see that there have been a lot of wins already happening in society around this thing. Whatever it might be, if we can get little small wins and start to build some momentum in support of the initiative before we actually roll it out, it'd be way easier for the people on your team, or even for yourself if you're doing this personally, to make sure that you want to move forward in a meaningful way. So big picture is really thinking about what can you do before the change initiative rolls out to make sure that it's connected to your mission. You've already got the right people influenced on your team. You've got good data-driven evidence, and then you've got those kind of intuitive emotional stories, and that you're doing small little things like creating experiences ahead of time or manufacturing small wins ahead of time to make sure that people are bought in and ready. Now, a tremendous tool for us to consider as we're preparing for a change initiative, something called Kotter's 8-step model of change. And of course, you can visit kotterinternational.com and take a look at this. And I'm not going to describe it too in depth because the website has some really significant tools and good resources, books, white papers, videos to help you through this. But it's a very, very easy model to effectively follow if you're trying to facilitate change either personally and or for your team. So I'm just a big fan of each step. So take a look at that website to give you just a little bit of context or framework here, because you can figure out how to get people on board. You can make sure that the mission, vision, values are appropriate, make sure you get the right volunteers engaged. As a leader, you can make sure you're removing barriers to make sure that your team is developing appropriately. Again, creating those short-term wins. And then what step number 8 is really looking at how do you make the change just a part of everyday culture for the company. And so I think when you move through steps 1 through 8, you'll see how it builds upon itself to make sure that the change just gets baked into the culture for your business. Now, the second framework I'd like to suggest or for you to consider is something called the competing values framework. And this was developed back in the early 1980s. It's called the Quinn-Rohrbaugh model. Changingminds.org has a very, very good look at it and a good description of it. But really basically what it does is on the y-axis vertically, right at the very bottom, we're thinking about we want the culture of our organization to be very stable and very controlled. Whereas at the top, this type of organization would be very, very individual focused and much more flexible. Now on the x-axis on the left-hand side, an organization that's on the left-hand side of this kind of 4-box, they're very focused in on internal positioning and making sure that they're doing the right thing for their employees and their company. And the right-hand side, or the far right-hand side of the x-axis, looks at external positioning. And so there's a very, very good look here in trying to think about which culture is your business, because there's a clan culture, which is very much about leaders being facilitators and mentors and team builders. Or if you're hierarchical, the leader is much more of a coordinator. That person likes to monitor. They're very organized. They're very efficient. They're very cost effective, if you will. Now, in the upper right-hand corner is the culture type called adhocracy. This orientation, this business is very much about creation. The leader has to be very innovative. They're very entrepreneurial. They're very visionary, very much into consistent change. And the type in the bottom right-hand corner, the market type, these folks are very much about competition. So the leader here has to be very different from the other types, where he or she is very much a hard driver, very competitive, very much about production. And this leader is also really heavily focused in on customer focus, being very, very effective in delivering what that customer needs. So the competing values framework looks at these 4 different types and asks a leader to say, which organization are we and which organization do we desire to be? And depending on which one you desire to be, we have to think very holistic about the type of person who's going to lead the change initiative, the type of persons that are on that team, and really truly making sure that we've got the right leader, the right values in place, and the right meeting structures, one-to-one and or group, and or structures inside the business on a day-to-day basis to make sure that that specific culture is being lived, that also then puts us much, much closer to the goals that we have. All right, so now that we've looked at the big picture and looking at how tools like Kotter's 8-step or the competing values framework can add value, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into how you would communicate one-to-one with the persons on your team or to persons close to you. And so I think about this, that people can plug into one of three categories. Number one, they're skeptical of the change. Number two is they're neutral to the change, meaning that they're okay partially with it, but they're still a little bit stuck in the past and liking the safety and security of the past. And then the third one is that the person is on board with the change. So let's assume that you have someone on your team that is a bit skeptical of the change. And here are a few things that you can do to try to engage that skeptical person to get them to move forward in a meaningful way. One of the things that I would consider for each of you to do, or for you to consider or think about, is number one, how do we neutralize emotions with the skeptical person? And so having a one-to-one dialogue or discussion with them with regards to them being overly pessimistic or overly negative or overly gossipy, let's figure out a way to allow that person to vent their emotions in a way that allows all parties to say or to set a foundation or a baseline of here's where we are right now. Let's figure out a way to neutralize them. So just set up some sort of a one-to-one meeting to give the individuals a chance to be able to vent some of the things that are on their mind. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, wherever there's reactivity today, there's a wound from the past. And so it's not our job to become their personal counselor or their shrink, but we have to consider how impactful that person's emotions are going to be on the change initiative. So if we can at least take a little bit of the edge off through that process, we're going to be in much better shape. Another thing here is I'm overly cautious with being reasonable about promises, because if there are skeptical persons on the team and we make promises and then we don't fulfill them, that's the exact opposite of manufacturing those small wins. All of a sudden now we're manufacturing losses, and that is not going to make them happy. They're just going to become less productive, more disengaged, more gossipy with your team, whatever it might be. So we have to make sure that when we neutralize the emotions, we automatically set very reasonable expectations with them for whatever actions might be taken next. Again, Robert Cialdini's look at influence, one of the first law is something called the law of reciprocity. And it states that if we can do something very nice for a person, psychologically, they're going to want to return the favor to us. And so if we're willing to offer up something nice to the skeptical person, in exchange, they will do something for us in return. And you can ask about those things directly if you need to. But if you need to employ the law of reciprocity, I think it's a good value add thing to get the person to move from being skeptical to a place of being neutral. Now, undoubtedly, in the change process, you're going to have employees who are already on board with the new initiative. So if your message is not landing with the skeptical person, there might be some value add in you having one of your other colleagues who is already on board with the change and having him or her have some dialogue with the skeptical employee to see if that helps to move them along quickly as well. I'm also a big fan of compromise, right? We talked about how the high D people on the disc like to compete and they're more of a win-lose type person. I'm a bigger fan of trying to find a collaboration or some sort of a compromise and a middle ground here. So we don't want people to accommodate or avoid us during conflict with a skeptical person. We want to find a compromise where all parties are getting to the point of win-win. If you need to, things aren't working very well with the skeptical person, one of Cialdini's laws called the law of authority is that because you have a title or because you're the leader of this change or because you're the CEO of your business, you get to evoke the law of authority and be very direct with the person about the lack of movement or progress from him or her. So if we're running into a problem where they're just simply not doing the work, it would be very prudent for you to say, hey, if you don't do this, here is the potential negative impact on your next performance review or on your next paycheck or whatever it might be. But you can evoke the law of authority if necessary with a skeptical person. And then lastly, another thing here is to sell the cost of inaction. So if the skeptical person continues to not take action, make sure that you tell them, but as a result of them not doing it, here are the 1, 2, 3 consequences that are going to impact them. And that could be discipline, it could be a poor performance review, it could be that they're going to get fired, whatever it is, just make sure that we lay the groundwork for that very transparently ahead of time so that they are not surprised when things begin to change, because we want to make sure that they were made well aware and then supported via email or some sort of communication to confirm that they did in fact know that the change was coming and that they knew what to expect. Now, the second type of individual here that we really want to get tactical with is this person who's neutral. Now, they've got a toe in the old way of doing things and they've got a toe in the new way of doing things. So, of course, you can use each of the skeptical tactics we just talked about. But another thing you want to do is, because they're neutral, we can begin to think a little bit more logically and linearly with them. And so we talked earlier about making sure that we really had those good, solid, evidence-based stories, or that we had really, really good, intuitive, kind of emotional, relationship-driven content. And so through one-to-one dialogue, if you can appeal to their communication preference or to their motivator by offering the appropriate facts to get them on board, or by offering the appropriate emotional stories to get them on board, I think it's a very simple but easy tactic for them. So neutral folks might also be interested in a very linear presentation for you to lay out step by step what they're going to be experiencing over the next couple of months or years. So make sure that you have a step-by-step process laid out and how that process may impact him or her. So if the person is neutral, if they see exactly what their future may hold, or as close as possible, the likelihood of them wanting to then do it is much higher. So be very in tune with that, or be very aware of that. If you can give them an easy to follow linear presentation, it's much, much simpler for them to want to participate. Another thing here is just obviously very open and frank dialogue. Just if the person's neutral and they're ready to move forward, just ask them really specific questions about what it is that they really want out of the arrangement. And so if there's something that you can incent them with, or something that's going to motivate them to move forward, figure out a way to offer it to them in a way that's beneficial to their development, but also at the same time beneficial for the strategic objective or whatever the change initiative is to be met. One of Cialdini's other laws, maybe that would be interesting to help a neutral person, is called the law of commitment or consistency. And what it says is that if a person has taken the same behavior 3, 4, or 5 times prior to today, and then all of a sudden on the 5th or 6th time they choose a slightly different action, the leader should call that person out on the 5th or 6th time and then point out and say, on times 1, 2, 3, and 4, you chose this option or this path. Why did you all of a sudden change? Now, the likelihood is that the person will likely go back and change and want to do things consistently, because humans don't want to be perceived as irrational. They want to be perceived as rational. They want to be perceived as consistent, that they take very logical, consistent action. So if you see a person who has taken really consistent action that's in support of your change initiative, and then all of a sudden they choose not to, make sure that you go back and call them out for that thing, because that's the thing that might move them from being in the neutral place to being on board. So for the folks who are already on board with your change initiative, if need be, depending on scenario or situation, you can use the skeptical or neutral tactics that we just talked about. But what I would do with these individuals is a little bit different. I would get them moving to action really quickly. So if you have a cross-functional guiding coalition set up that's leading the change initiative, I would have the onboard individuals on this team or leading this team as much as you can. I would make sure that they were planning and resourcing and executing on whatever the vision is as quickly as possible, because we need those small wins to be able to drive the initiative forward. So the onboard people should be the ones driving it forward. Another important tactic for the onboard folks is social proof. So another Cialdini law is the law of social proof. And so if an onboard individual is already really interested in and already participating in the change initiative, allow the onboard individual to continue to drive that social proof and to expand his or her network, or to get the team to be bigger, so that those short-term wins not only are happening, but then they're being marketed to the rest of the team through e-newsletters, through town halls, through one-to-one conversation, through team small group meetings, whatever it might be. But we want to make sure that the onboard individuals are driving that, because more likely than not, he or she will be very, very willing to share his or her story openly. And that success, or that openness, or that transparency, that vulnerability is key to getting some of those other skeptical or neutral members on board with the change initiative. So if we already have people who are on board, let's find a way to get them sharing their story about the change initiative, how it's helped them in their career, their life, and then how the other persons who are neutral or skeptical can jump in and be helped by that as well. So as we start to wrap up this podcast, thanks guys for listening. I'm going to talk just a few minutes here about some best practices that I've seen work through change. So whether it's you dealing with some scenarios or situations for yourself, or if it is you trying to facilitate some change inside of a business, one of the first things that I like to ask about when I'm dealing with an executive team is who are the negative influencers on the team, and are they prone to gossip? Are they prone to passive aggressive behavior? Are they doing things behind the scenes that nobody knows about? And if so, those are the persons we need to go and talk to first. So a best practice would be to find those negative influencers and go to them as quickly as possible to try to convert them to neutral or on board, so that they're not going to inhibit the process as we're trying to lay it out into the future. So as we learned at the beginning of the podcast with regards to Colin's work and his book Good to Great, or McKinsey and Company's consulting and some of their change initiative work, lack of communication inside of an organization is very, very hurtful to the change initiative being successful. So another best practice would be to make sure that you're over communicating to your team as quickly as you can, in one-to-one dialogue, one-to-many in groups, through emails, through town halls, through videos that you can disperse amongst your team quickly, whatever it might be. We need to make sure that we over-communicate as much as possible, because if we don't deliver meaningful, factual information, people will begin to make things up in their mind, because obviously fear is such a big driver for humans. So we want to mitigate and suffocate out all of that stuff and make sure that we're giving them more information that can help them stay grounded and stay rational through the process. I'm also a big fan of thinking about and just expecting problems. We know that problems are going to happen through the process. So what can you do ahead of time to assess and make sure that we know that the problems are going to be there, but what are the most likely areas that they're going to happen? Because if we know where they're going to happen, then we can do everything possible to make sure that we've created risk mitigation strategies around them. And that will help us to make sure that we keep the timeline of the change initiative condensed, that we keep people heavily focused. So again, something important, right? This change process needs to happen very quickly. Slow change just doesn't work, because people will come up with too many other things, or they won't spend the appropriate amount of time on it. And so even if your team is already stretched pretty thin with regards to labor hours or something, make sure that you're doing a good job of facilitating this change as quickly as possible, because the more that it becomes a part of everyday life, the better off your team is going to be in the long term. Now, a thing that I've seen as a best practice that many organizations haven't practiced is aligning employee reward systems with the new change, whatever that might be. And so as an example, if you are rewarding each of the members of your team individually and giving them individual commission and some sort of specific compensation bonus for their work as an individual, but yet the change initiative is very much about teamwork and collaboration and moving together as a unit, we would need to adjust the employer reward systems to fit in with the collaboration mindset. So instead of it rewarding the individual, you would find a way to be able to reward the team monetarily or some other way for the work that they've done together. And so oftentimes this can be a big limiting factor in change, because you're rewarding a person for something that's important to them, but not for what the organization's actually trying to accomplish longer term. Another best practice here is that organizations are great at training persons on specific hard skills, but oftentimes don't give them the soft skills. And we talked at the beginning of the podcast about emotional intelligence and helping folks overcome fears. And I'm just a really big fan of organizations that do a great job of teaching emotional intelligence, or setting up coaching models, or doing a great job of mentorship and reverse mentorship, because as you climb the corporate ladder, your technical skill becomes far less important than your emotional intelligence. So if you're going to facilitate some change inside of your business, make sure that there's some training offered to the team on emotional intelligence and soft skills, communication-wise, not just purely hard process skills. And I think that that's probably one of the things organizations struggle. And so last best practice is that if you have really weak links on your team in terms of persons, make sure that we're doing a good job of finding that person another role within the organization. Or as I've heard an executive say it more recently, you can promote an underperforming employee to customer, meaning you can fire the person and make them a customer of yours. And now it's kind of a silly or a funny way to say that you're going to fire a person, that you're going to promote them. but it is a very interesting look at how important it is to make sure that all players on your team are strong enough to move the initiative forward. So you can't have any of those very weak links on your team because it's not going to allow the organization to advance as quickly. So again, best practice, make sure you talk to those negative influencers first, over-communicate through a variety of channels, mitigate risks with associated problems ahead of time, make the change happen as quickly as possible, make sure that your employee compensation systems are aligned with where the business is going, make sure that your organization is training persons on both hard and soft skills simultaneously, and then make sure that any underperforming employees are either moved to a different part of the business or are not a part of your business anymore. So in today's podcast about leading through change, we got to look at a little bit of a brief opening reflection, thinking about where we might have been able to improve on some of our own change initiatives. I walked through a few things with regards to societal change and thinking about the transition from pure push media now to a more consumer-driven, a more grassroots-driven pull media, the value of entrepreneurship and self-discovery, which is a very big thing in understanding change or being ready for it, or even fundamental attribution error in understanding, why is it that a human looks at him or herself very different in the way that they look at other people around them. So just being aware that we have these biases in place is pretty important. We talked a little bit about why change is difficult, from thinking of behavioral preferences to what motivates us, to the life's experiences that have shaped us, to our level of emotional intelligence, or even the things that we fear the most. Took a bit of a deep dive into some of the things regarding DISC or the 12 driving forces, or even the model that I utilize in helping people uncover and live their life's mission. And then we looked a little bit about, hey, before we get started, let's take a quick step back and look at the big picture. How do we focus on mission, vision, values? Who do we build relationships with? What's the right pieces of evidence and or stories that we need? How do we create those immersive experiences? How do we utilize Kotter's 8-step model and the competing values framework to get some wins moving and to make sure that the leadership structure and processes are in place to really drive the business forward? We then took a deep dive into the skeptical, neutral, and onboard individuals to making sure that each of them was taking the appropriate part in the change initiative process to make sure that we're leading them appropriately. And then we just covered, of course, some best practices with regards to that. And so obviously that's a ton of information and, probably an hour's worth of time. But I think it's a really important thing for us to understand and to look at a high level what's changing in society, a little bit more what is really happening structurally or systemically within our business, and then how do we go deep with each individual that is doing well or not doing so well with change, because likely there's some small nugget of wisdom that we've talked about in the last hour that you'll be able to pull and be able to apply to your organization or to somebody in your life pretty quickly. And to me, that's pretty important. So I appreciate you listening. I appreciate your time. Obviously, the value or the currency of the 21st century is human attention. So I very appreciate the fact that you gave me yours for this probably hour or so. So thank you very much for that. I do appreciate it. I hope you have an awesome day. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of Equal Chance to Be Unequal. I'm Michael S. Seaver. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on iTunes and like, share, or comment on this podcast on michaelsseaver.com, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube. Go forth and be awesome.